have a good debate for you. It's called Drone Strikes in the Law, or as you've seen the posters, Drones, Robots in Disguise. An awesome title, I think. There's a few things I want to mention. Our next event is our final event for the month of January, and I suspect for many of you it will be probably the last opportunity to pay for dues. Dues are again $5. The due to Thad, he's our secretary. He's currently somewhere, but you've probably seen him. He's wearing a suit today with a red tie, so he'll be sitting down here with us. After the event, if you want to pay him the dues, feel free to do so. Again, you don't have to pay dues to come to any of our events or eat our pizza. If you do want to run for office next year, or if you want to vote for the elections, then you'll be asked that you pay dues. I'll explain the format, and then I'll give a brief introduction for our speakers before we get going. Normally, we do have our guest speaker speak first. In this case, that would have been Professor Lewis, but at both the parties' request, Professor Quigley will be starting us off. And for the debate format, we usually allow for a 12-minute introduction by each speaker, and then we'll go to a 10-minute rebuttal. And following that, we'll have questions and answers from the audience. And here are the introductions. First, Professor Michael Lewis teaches at Ohio Northern's Claude W. Petit College of Law. Professor Lewis flew F-14s for the Navy in operations as a shield. He conducted strike planning for Desert Storm and was deployed to the Persian Gulf to enforce the no-fly zone over Iraq. He was a Top Gun graduate in '92 and was featured in the Nova documentary on Top Gun and aircraft carriers. During his naval service, or after his naval service, Professor Lewis graduated from Harvard Law School cum laude and was a management consultant with McKinsey & Company and served as a litigation associate with McGuire Woods in Norfolk. Professor Lewis received the Award for Excellence in Classroom Teaching in 2007, the 08 academic year, and he teaches, among many other things, the Law Course Seminar as well as the International and Comparative Law courses. Professor Quigley, many of you know, he's done a lot of our events. We're grateful to him for that. He's been with the Ohio State faculty since 1969 and is one of the nation's most prominent legal scholars on international human rights work. His numerous publications include books and articles on human rights, the UN, war and peace, Eastern European law, African law, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. In '95, he was the recipient of Ohio State's own Distinguished Scholar Award, and he teaches the law of war and international law classes here at Moritz, amongst other things. Please join me in welcoming first Professor Quigley.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start out with your indulgence to show a video that runs about 5 minutes that indicates some of the difficulties that I see with the use of drones and the way that they're presently being used in Pakistan. The name that you see on the banner is the name of the former head of the CIA office of the U.S. government in Islamabad. He had to leave Pakistan a few weeks ago after some lawyers, and in particular the lawyer that you'll see in the video, named him in demanding that the government of Pakistan conduct a criminal investigation against him for the killing of Pakistani civilians by the use of drones. That's who that person is.
These people you're seeing here, they are the victims of drone attacks. All of them have come from North Waziristan Agency to Islamabad to raise their voice. I think if you just look into the figures of drone attacks, how they have drastically increased, this was high time that someone takes notice of it. Because if you look at 2004, one attack, 2005, two attacks, and then the number starts growing. But in the last 2 years, the number has just grown drastically, and no one is talking about it. Karim Khan is a person, he's a journalist by profession. His brother and son have been killed last year in the drone attacks in North Waziristan Agency in Birali, Tehsil. And he started a legal action against the CIA. Now these people who were drone attack victims from Birali, North Waziristan Agency, they have come and joined hands with him. And now we have 15 drone attack family victims who are claiming damages for the wrongful deaths of the loved ones.
There is no such a government, no such organization who helps these pure people of Fatah and Fatah.
The case is brought under the civil law. It's under the court law, which is very well Our whole case is that they are not part of the war, and they have no connection whatsoever with militants or Taliban and opposition agency, and they are pure civilian innocent victims who are being attacked by the drone attacks. And for their wrongful death, we are asking CIA to pay damages for 2 victims, $500 million. And now we have more victims here, so we can be more damages in this case. And it will be a class action as we call it in the US. These are the 2 different things we are working on here. One is the constitutional claim which we are bringing against the Pakistani government for their inaction in this. Because I cannot believe that our government can allow these attacks to happen. Because if they do allow, this is completely illegal, ultra-constitutional stuff, which they are not allowed by the Constitution to take. So even if a American government is acting on their authority, they are acting on an illegal authority. And for that you have Nuremberg trials in your history. You can see what happens to those people who acted on illegal or immoral authorities. But apart from the constitutional action against our government, we are going against the American Executive Department, which is carrying out these killings, because we name them as killings, nothing more and nothing less. And we are hopeful that they will pay. If not here, then we will try to go to US as well under Alien Courts Act. His name is Sadaullah, and he is a 7th grade student. When there was an attack on his house, he lost both his legs, one of his eye, and he also lost his uncle, paternal uncle, who was on wheelchair for the last 6 years. And he also lost 2 of his cousins, who were the breadwinner basically for the family. So now he's left with a grandfather and himself. And this is they have some women folk of the family to look after. And he cannot learn, he's still going to school in 7th grade. And he's just one example.
I want to leave, but I have nowhere to go.
So these are the types of victims who are brought. They, by no stretch of imagination, they seem to be part of any Taliban network or any militant activity going on in that area as it's stated. Based on media reports, and we have a number which is over 2,000 victims of drone attacks so far, carried out in 6 years. But you also have to see that this number has really grown in the last couple of years, because up till 2007 there were only 7 drone attacks. But now in 2010 we have more than 200 drone attacks carried out in the tribal area. Since Mr. Obama took over as president, the drone attacks have drastically increased. And I would call it the quality of the intelligence gathered is not really up to the mark. The CIA chief and defense secretary are on record saying that these attacks are very precise and they act on precise intelligence. So we are challenging their precise intelligence, such kind of an awareness. I just want to give an option to people, the innocent people who are living in the tribal areas, that this is one other option, because if you push them against the wall, then if this militancy and terrorism is going to increase. This is not the solution, because if you are attacking them by drones, and they're not part of the war, they have the Taliban on the other side. Which party they will be joined? Because their brethren in several areas of Pakistan, they're not ready to listen or raise their voice. So who is going to help them seek justice? Then they will go to the tribal customs and ask for revenge, and then they, manage to somehow get their drones done. That's not the solution of the problem. The solution is that we bring them into the system, through the system, and through the legal courts to get them justice.
The people in the video were from the area that's called Waziristan in the northern part of Pakistan, which is on the border with Afghanistan. And so the rationale for the drone attacks is that there are combatants who are using that area to stage military operations in Afghanistan. So that's the basis for the use of these craft. I mean, drones are aircraft that originally were used for intelligence purposes, that is, for gathering information. And in the last few years, the capability has come about where they can be used to fire, and that's the way they're being used now. But the lawyer that's bringing this did identify the fellow as Mr. Banks as the CIA station chief, although as I understand it, his identity was not particularly secret in Pakistan. But after this legal action began, there were death threats made against him, and the CIA decided it was not safe for him to continue to remain in Pakistan, so they pulled him out. That, is one significant negative consequence of the use of drones. That is, if you develop this kind of hostility on the part of the local population, it will have a variety of negative consequences for the United States. One that this lawyer reverted to at the end was that it makes people hate the United States. And that can have very negative consequences in a number of ways. Recently there was a fellow, as you probably heard, who brought some explosives into Times Square in New York in a vehicle and left them there with the intention that they would explode. He was arrested, taken before a judge in the U.S. District Court, Southern District of New York, and the judge asked him, what did you think was going to happen? Who was going to be killed? It would be civilians, it would be all kinds of people that would be killed by this. How could you do such a thing? The judge said, did you look around to see who they were? That is, the people who were there when you left the vehicle. And he answered, well, the people select the government. We consider them all the same. So he's not making a distinction between combatants and others. And the judge then says, including the children, and he says, the drone hits in Afghanistan and Iraq, they don't see children, they don't see anybody. They kill women and children, they kill everybody. They're killing all Muslims. So he is in effect using the drone attacks as a rationale for terrorist actions against civilians in the United States. And I think that's one significant risk that we run with this kind of operation. The question under the law that relates to use of force during wartime is one of distinction between military and civilian objectives. And the lawyer in Pakistan is saying that there is significant negative consequence to civilians. That goes beyond what is permitted. Under the law of war, it is not unlawful to kill civilians if it is sufficiently incidental. But the dividing line is not very clear on this. And I've seen various figures about the percentage of civilians, the percentage of persons who are at least identified by whatever means as combatants. But the percentage of civilians is rather large among all of those that are killed in these attacks. Are we up to 12? Okay, I'll stop there.
No, you can keep going. I just wanted to let you know that.
You're getting close.
Yeah.
Finish your thought.
Okay. But this matter has been taken up by the United Nations Human Rights Apparatus. There was a resolution in the Human Rights Council on the issue. There's in the Human Rights Council of the UN, there is a procedure that they call special rapporteurs that focus on different issues in human rights. There's a special rapporteur on the topic of what they call extrajudicial killings. And this special rapporteur on that subject has been very critical of the United States on this issue and has said that the United States should make more information available about who gets killed in these attacks and that he considers this to be an extrajudicial killing and something that's illegal under international law. You may have seen just in the last few days, the New York Times is publishing information saying that the information that's used to identify where to strike with the drones is very difficult to collect with precision, and that those who are sitting in Nevada, which is where this is done from, who direct the drones to strike in Pakistan, that they get so much information that they're suffering from what the New York Times refers to as information overload, and that's part of the reason why the attacks are not as precise as the U.S. government would like them to be. I'll stop at that point.
If you want to talk about information overload, try doing this as a pilot. One of the big differences between drone attacks and manned aircraft attacks is, as Professor Quigley mentioned very accurately, civilian deaths do happen in wartime. Civilian deaths can legally happen in wartime as long as they are proportional to the military advantage gained. So the idea is you're supposed to distinguish between civilians and combatants. You're supposed to only target combatants, and you must do everything you can to reduce the civilian casualties when you are striking the combatant targets. But the argument that drones are more problematic than airstrikes actually doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about how that works. You have a single pilot who is given the discretion to choose whether or not he has accurately identified the target, whether or not he has accurately cleared the area to determine whether there are civilians likely to be struck. He has one, maybe two passes to do that. He's got other things on his mind, like maybe being shot at, as well as just flying his aircraft. If you think that texting and driving is difficult, try delivering ordnance and flying while evading surface-to-air missiles, etc., or just ground fire. The bottom line is that is the difficult thing to do. It's far less difficult for law to get involved and for law to check the kinds of attacks that are being made if you are in a Nevada Command Operations Room. Because in the Nevada Command Operations Room, not only do you have the drone pilots there, but you have as many other people as you would like, whether they're senior commanders, other pilots, lawyers, intelligence officers. They are all there, and they are all available to give checks to the decision before the weapon is employed. And as a result of that, drones actually allow for a much greater intervention of law on the battlefield than does the use of manned aircraft. I think there's something about drones, about robots in the sky, or however you want to phrase it, that seems kind of creepy and kind of unfair. You know, we're not putting our people at risk, and yet we are doing damage to the enemy and possibly the civilian population as well. But the fact of the matter is, drones, I think, are better at ensuring legal strikes than are either special forces, which is one other option, or targeted manned aircraft attacks, because both of those end up relying on the discretion of very few people who have very divided attention. If you're a special forces guy, there are 3 or 4 of you in there conducting the attack, you are worried about other people coming after you, other people finding you, shooting at you, etc. Your ability, again, to make that decision is going to be very compromised by the divided attention compared to a much more sanitary environment like a drone strike. The other thing I'd say about sort of this made-for-TV issue, and you think about what the language in Pakistan is, and yet the banners are in English. This was done for a specific reason. Part of it was to try to get the CIA's attention. Part of it is to try to get CNN's attention, or whoever else, what other English language broadcasters can bring this out. That's what that group was trying to do, was trying to talk to Americans or English speakers as opposed to Pakistanis. And I would say that at some level, some of this outrage may be manufactured. I don't deny that there are mistakes made and that there are civilians killed in the border regions by Americans, either special forces or drones or manned aircraft. All of that has happened. And all of that clearly does generate bad feeling, particularly for the individuals affected and their families. But if you read the open source papers that are available, and I had a professor at UVA, Echery Jen, who compiled a number of those from people who had just been over in Pakistan and from the local Pakistani writings that are available from Waziristan. The impression there is far different from what you get reading the Times editorial page. And that impression is that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are very unpopular in Waziristan. The general population just wants to live their lives. They would rather the Americans and the Taliban and everybody just leave them alone if that's possible. Now, currently it's not possible because there is this insurgency going on across the border in Afghanistan and in Waziristan, a battle for control. But the fact of the matter is most people dislike Al-Qaeda more than they dislike us, more than they dislike the Pakistani government, because Al-Qaeda's methods are far more brutal. They complain about some civilian casualties here. The fact of the matter is Al-Qaeda targets civilians intentionally, in large numbers. That is the way they fight their war. And that's all they do. They kill civilians as many as they can, as often as they can. That's what they do. And the people in Waziristan do not like that. But they only have two options. Your two options are having the United States get rid of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, or the Pakistani army get rid of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And the fact of the matter is that when the Pakistani army went on the offensive in the Kut Valley, an area in Waziristan, they were not nearly as discriminating as we were. They use artillery in large amounts because it's safer for them, and they kill a whole lot of civilians when they go in without doing a whole lot of damage to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And if you read the open source papers, what the people in Waziristan are actually saying broadly, not a made-for-TV movie, but broadly, what they are saying is the Americans are more effective. They kill the Taliban and Al-Qaeda more often than the Pakistani army does. And the collateral damage they do is not nearly as intensive because they don't use artillery at all. They send in special forces, they send in drones. And a lot of the figures that you see in the New York Times or something like that, talking about the casualties inflicted by drones, are greatly exaggerated. And the reason for this is because whenever there's a drone strike, Al-Qaeda seals off the area, right? It's in Waziristan. If it was someplace we could access on the ground safely, we would do that. We can't do that because it's enemy-held territory. So what happens is there's a drone strike, Al-Qaeda seals off the area, they seal off the hospitals, and they report the numbers. This is who died, and this is who didn't die, and this is how we're reporting it. And the fact of the matter is they have a tremendous amount of control over the information that gets out. And if you look at, there's a meta-study called Rise of the Drones, which goes into great detail. It categorized every single drone attack over a great period of time, and it compares the New York Times numbers and the BBC's numbers into the open source, the Western media's description of drone attacks, accuracy, efficacy, and it has, you know, the New York Times will say it's orders of magnitude more civilians than fighters or enemy that were killed. And if you go to other sources, though, local sources that are arguably far more reliable, you find that the information is much closer to a 1-to-1 ratio between enemy fighters killed and civilians killed. Now, it shouldn't be 1-to-1. It should be even lower than that if at all possible. But the bottom line is that the inaccuracy and inefficacy of drones has been vastly overstated by the American media in many ways. And I think if you dig deeply into studies like Rise of the Drones, which categorizes it all, you get a feel for where those numbers really are. And you see that the impact we're having is more positive than negative in the eyes of the people of Waziristan. Thanks.
Good, thank you, Professor Lewis. I mean, we're very fortunate to have someone this level of expertise within driving distance of Columbus. So this is not the first time Professor Lewis has been able to come. come, so we're very pleased. I mean, you should know. I mean, he's a figure on this issue at the national level. You're not going to find people that know more about the law and about the practice, as you've heard from his background. But it seems to me, in terms of distinguishing between civilians and combatants, even if it's 1-to-1, that's way off. I mean, if you're killing as many civilians as you're killing combatants, you're not distinguishing between civilians and combatants. That's a violation of the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention, which makes you make that distinction. I don't think it's quite fair to say that drones are more accurate than manned aircraft, because I don't see that as being the choice. I mean, if the aim is to identify a particular combatant or militant, as they're referred to, and to kill that person, I mean, you can't send a big aircraft, to go at somebody's house. I mean, you could, but I mean, obviously a drone is more accurate in that exercise than manned aircraft. But I think the real question is whether you should be doing either of those, and whether either of those can be done consistently with humanitarian law. I think, as the lawyer in the video was saying, from the standpoint of the population, this is a fairly scary thing, to know that at any time something can come out of the sky and hit in your area. I mean, suppose, for example, that the Columbus police decided that there are too many drug dealers in certain neighborhoods in Columbus, and they were going to shoot at their houses from helicopters. I mean, if you lived in the neighborhood, you would not feel very safe. And I think that's essentially what the people in this area are thinking. And I think in the long term, it really does run for the United States a serious risk of turning people against us, even though, as Professor Lewis, I think, accurately says, the other side is treating people in ways that can generate that hostility as well. We've been focusing here only on issues relating to what's called jus in bello, that is on the assumption that the military action in itself is legitimate. We could take the discussion to another level and say, should the United States be carrying out any kind of military action in Pakistan? Is it legal for the United States to do that? And if you were to answer that question in the negative, then obviously the drones and anything else would be a negative. I think there are serious issues on that. I think myself that there probably is not a lawful basis for what we're doing in Pakistan, but that's something that's an issue for another day.
To the extent we want to engage on that, I think it isn't a bad issue for today at some level. If we want to talk about the legality of targeting in Pakistan, and this is sort of reminiscent of the Anwar al-Awlaki lawsuit, which I want to bring up briefly because I think it encapsulates in a lot of ways exactly how the laws of war are in danger of being upset and turned on their head. The al-Awlaki lawsuit basically says al-Awlaki, who's an American Yemeni cleric, he's an American citizen, dual American Yemeni citizen, who has planned operations for Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, currently resides in Yemen, was implicated in the Fort Hood shooting, in the Detroit underpants bombing, etc. The ACLU filed an injunction against or attempted to file an injunction against the Obama administration saying you cannot use drones to strike al-Awlaki because he's in Yemen. There is a war in Afghanistan, there is a war in Iraq, there is no war in Pakistan, there is no war in Yemen. You cannot use the tools of armed conflict to get him there. You can use law enforcement, go arrest him, but you cannot use the tools of armed conflict because there's no armed conflict there. That's kind of the jus ad bellum, as Professor Quigley said, the jus ad bellum way of looking at it. If there's no war, the laws of war don't apply. The problem with that, and the reason why it threatens to really turn the Geneva Conventions on their head, is that you have to basically understand the Geneva Conventions looks at people in two ways. They're combatants and civilians. Combatants have to be members of an organization that obeys and enforces the laws of war. So U.S. soldiers are combatants because we put people in jail for violating the laws of war. If you violate the laws of war in Iraq or Afghanistan, we have put many of our soldiers, not many, but I mean a fair number of our soldiers have been jailed or and otherwise punished for violating the laws of war. We enforce that. Our people are combatants. The advantage of being a combatant is that you are given what's called a combatant's privilege, which means that the damage you do while operating under the laws of war is not something you can be criminally charged for, as long as you are operating within the laws of war. Civilians don't get the combatant's privilege. Civilians are not allowed to do harm or participate in hostilities. What civilians get is immunity. Civilians are not supposed to be targeted. And because civilians are defined negatively, that is, all people who are not combatants are civilians, then Anwar al-Awlaki or Osama bin Laden or Khalid Sheikh Mohammed are all civilians. And as such, they would have immunity. They could not be attacked unless they are directly participating in hostilities. And that's the one exception to civilian immunity. You forfeit that immunity when you directly participate in hostilities. There's a contention about the gray areas about that definition, but what clearly is included in direct participation in hostilities, firing weapons, planting bombs, or having a direct leadership role in telling people to do those things consistently. So Osama bin Laden and Anwar al-Awlaki are leaders and therefore targetable under IHL. The only way the al-Awlaki lawsuit works is if you buy into this idea that geography determines where the law of war applies or not. Historically, the law of war goes where the warriors go, and so if al-Awlaki's in Yemen, then you can strike him in Yemen. But this idea of saying we have a geographical basis, you can't do it in Pakistan, you can't do it in Yemen, essentially says we are giving the initiative to terrorists. And anybody who knows anything about tactics and strategy in the military understands that initiative, the ability to decide when, where, and how a conflict takes place, is immensely valuable, and you do anything and everything you can to gain and maintain the initiative in any kind of conflict. And this reading of it, saying if you can get to Yemen, if you can get to Somalia, if you can get to Sudan, where there is no effective law enforcement, if you can get into the Waziristan region of Pakistan, where there's no effective law enforcement, you as a terrorist now have a sanctuary. You cannot be struck using the tools of war. You may only be captured using law enforcement. Law enforcement's not effective, you're safe. If the laws of war are read to give terrorists a sanctuary, it basically says you have the initiative. You get to decide where the war is fought. Is the next battle in London or Mumbai or Washington or New York or Madrid or Bali? Right? They get to decide where all of this takes place. We don't get to decide any of it because we can't strike them anymore. And the idea that the laws of war, which deny these people combatants' privilege, which strip them of civilian immunity and clearly place them at the bottom, at the least privileged position, and they do that because these people target civilians. They do the worst thing that you can do in international law, is intentionally try to kill as many civilians as possible. That's why they lose their privilege, lose their immunity. And yet this reading of international law would say, oh, but by the way, you get sanctuary and you have the initiative for the balance of the conflict. That reading of international law, I think, turns everything on its head. Thanks.
All right, at this point, we'll open up to questions and answers.
Yeah, maybe I missed something you said, but are there figures that would estimate that drones are, usage of drones is more deadly to civilians than usage of regular manned aircraft, or the best idea with the little figures?
No, I don't think, I mean, the rise of the drones detail that I have seen does not break it down by manned aircraft versus not. All it does is it looks at the drone strikes that have gone on. And the fact of the matter is we have not really used manned aircraft much in Pakistan at all, so I'm not sure that there are apples-to-apples comparisons. I think just sort of arguing from general understanding and general principles, I'd much rather have 10 eyes or 20 eyes looking at a strike before I do it than relying on the discretion of one pilot whose attention is, by definition, very divided at the time he or she is employing the weapon. But I don't think that there are apples-to-apples figure comparisons to say one is more accurate. I just think that it stands to reason it is so.
Well, that brings my second question, is that I've heard a lot of things on Moritz said that attacks like that are kind of very ineffective fighting insurgency because essentially the more people you kill, the more people you have to against you. You want more discreet type things versus flank drills or dropping bombs and things. Is that anything that you can say? Off base?
No, not at all. And counterinsurgency is absolutely correct. You know, the coin manual that goes into all the details of how to best counter an insurgency, and a lot of that has to do with winning hearts and minds. And you do that by being discriminating in who you attack, in not killing civilians, and doing all that you can to not kill civilians. The one thing, and the British, for example, in Helmand Province in Afghanistan, for a period of time, took the position of what was called courageous restraint. If you are fired at, you are not supposed to fire back unless you knew that no civilians would be hurt. Which is a hard thing to do for a soldier, is to say, just take cover, get out of the way, don't fire back until you know that you're not going to get the other side, kill any civilians. And what they have done is they've evolved that tactic from courageous restraint into sort of more of an identify and counterstrike, which is, and this is where drones are very useful. You don't have to get them today, you can get them tomorrow. You can sit overhead and loiter for hours or days, follow the guy, find out what his habits are, find out where he is, and then try to get special forces for a drone to strike him. And that's absolutely the way that things should be done. And I think that's generally the way things are done. There are mistakes made, there's no question. And mistakes are going to be very highly publicized because that's part of the way an insurgency wins, is by highlighting the mistakes and making it seem like the norm. And to the extent that it is reported as the norm, we begin to believe that drones are very ineffective and very inaccurate, and special forces always kill the wrong people. But the fact of the matter is that, we did the same thing in Iraq. You had to win the same hearts and minds there. And the other part of a counterinsurgency is making the people believe that you're going to win. Because as I say, most people just want to live their lives. And if I think, well, you're going to be gone in a year, and these guys are going to still be here, who am I going to side with? I'm going to side with the people who I know are going to be here 2 and 3 years from now. And that's one of the huge flaws we have in our policy in Afghanistan right now, saying, we're coming in, but we're going to leave. And the idea of drawing a deadline and saying, we're pulling people out in July or whatever, was a terrible mistake that the administration made, because it is basically telling all of the civilian population who you have to win that we're not in for the long haul. And contrasting the approach the Obama administration took there with the Bush administration approach in Iraq is a clear contrast in styles, and I think we're seeing a clear contrast in results.
We're talking about drones, but we got into the complicated situations that arise in any conflict when it comes to interpreting the law of war. My question to both of you, well, what do you do if the Taliban and Al-Qaeda like to put their surface-to-air missiles on schools? What do you do if the enemy likes to put their ordnance lockers at the bottom of hospitals? These are questions that, so obviously that's a military target, but the civilian casualty rate will be high because the enemy has placed the target in a place where they know it's to be high. So my question is, how do you resolve these legal conflicts with the obvious military advantage that's gained by protecting American life by taking out these targets?
Clearly there's a prohibition in humanitarian law for putting your military operations in civilian areas along the lines you're suggesting. And that does change the equation some. And I think it does mean that when the other side attacks, that if they're getting more civilians than they would have had the military objective been separated somehow, that would mean that action would not be unlawful. The difficulty, I think, is in the fact that in many instances the people that are being targeted are living in places, they're living in houses, they're living in neighborhoods. And I think, as Professor Lewis says, that an effort is made to follow them, to try to get them when they're at a place where they're not in proximity to others. That's more the issue. here, I think, than that of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda putting their weapons in hospitals or grade schools, something of that sort. And when you do get into killing civilians in significant number, as Professor Lewis was saying, in an insurgency, I mean, you're really doing yourself in. General McChrystal, the former commander in Afghanistan, was very clear on this in some of the interviews he gave last summer, that he was very concerned that and he was talking about Afghanistan, that we were not being good enough in that. And he said that, you know, when you shoot, I think the way he put it was, when you shoot, you create an enemy. I mean, so the idea of shooting is that you kill an enemy. But he was saying, which I think is accurate, when you shoot, you run a very serious risk of creating an enemy. So if you're going to get people who will react to this the way that this fellow did with the explosive in Times Square, you've got to seriously think about the overall strategy. I mean, it may be that the U.S. military is killing some people that it wants to kill and thinks it needs to kill, but at what cost is that being done, even apart from the calculus about civilian versus military casualties?
The one thing I'd say to that is that it's very important to draw a distinction between law and policy, because there is a sense that a lot of people use to say that a strike like the one you're positing, we're trying to hit a military objective that has been intentionally put in a civilian area. The legality of that strike and the responsibility for the civilian deaths falls upon Al-Qaeda for putting the munitions in the basement of the hospital or whatever else. Legally, it falls upon them. But who cares about legality? There's a policy issue as well. But it's very important because a lot of people that are opposed to the use of drones, opposed to the Afghan war, etc., phrase and couch their criticisms in terms of law, saying, you know, he should go to jail for what has gone on. He shouldn't go to jail for bombing for hitting, you know, a military target that's been put in a civilian area. The people that put it in the civilian area should go to jail for that. But from a policy standpoint, McChrystal's right. You don't blow that one up. That is just not a good idea, because yes, there's a military advantage to taking out those weapons, but you're going to kill 30 civilians and create 200 people that really hate you as a result of that, so don't do it. But that's a policy decision and not a legal decision. And I think it's very important that the people involved in this debate make that, and I don't mean this debate, I mean the broad debate, make that distinction clear and be very accurate about saying this is a legal versus a policy choice. Because, as I say, much of it has been couched in terms of legality rather than policy. I agree completely with Professor Quigley that a policy decision should be made that we don't strike those targets. And the exceptions would be if they're really dangerous. If it's plutonium, if it's a weapon of mass destruction, maybe you need to do something like that. But in most cases, I don't care about a single anti-aircraft battery. I don't care about a cache of weapons. That's just not worth killing any civilians for at all. Right.
You said earlier that the use killing civilians is all right, and the use like during wartime and everything.
All right's a bit of a stretch, but fair.
It happens in wartime.
It happens, yes. It does happen.
Not unlawful.
It's not unlawful, exactly.
All right, so it's not unlawful and during time of war. I was wondering, has there been like any case law or types of policy that kind of factors in what it really means to kind of further the objectives of the government or further the objectives of the military, and saying, okay, you can kill civilians if it's going to further this X, Y, Z?
You look at, you're balancing, the official test is the harm to civilians and civilian infrastructure must be proportional to the military advantage gained. So the question is, what's the military advantage gained and how's it looked at? Some of the best case law or discussion of that comes out of the ICTY, the Tribunal for Yugoslavia, the attacks on the Belgrade radio station, and a couple of other things like that that went on, some of the bridges, And the ICTY prosecutor's report talked about how you should go about thinking about that. And the way you look at it is globally. So one example would be, if you go back to the '91 Gulf War, let's say there are 10 bridges between Iraq and Kuwait. If I hit a single bridge and I kill 3 civilians in knocking that bridge out, the military advantage gain is pretty much negligible because they'll just use the bridge 5 miles down the river. But if I knock out all 10 bridges and I kill 15 civilians in knocking out all 10 bridges and thereby cut the Iraqi army in Kuwait off from the Iraqi army in Iraq, there is a tremendous military advantage gained there because the Iraqi army in Kuwait now can no longer get resupplied. And that is a huge advantage that may be worth 15 civilian lives, but the single bridge is not worth 3 civilian lives. And so you generally aggregate it to say, well, what's the sum total of what you're trying to achieve here, as opposed to maybe looking at it from a strike-by-strike basis. I don't know if you had further comment on that.
That's true. I mean, it's a very difficult thing, and I think, as President Lewis says, that there isn't anything really precise that you can point to answer your question.
All the way back.
To what extent can the arrest consider the risk that they're putting their soldiers in? For instance, the American lives will be saved by using drones versus using special forces or fighter pilots. You know, and putting aside the issue of whether one or the other is more efficient, if a drone risks more civilian lives, but it doesn't put any American lives at stake, to what extent is that a legitimate justification?
Again, it would depend upon the calculus. I think that as a general rule, a civilian life is worth more than a military life. So if you're going to save, and there's no way of knowing what the actual math would be, but if you're going to do this sort of calculus of death, you say you've got to save a lot more than 1 military life in order to justify taking another civilian life. But if you're in a position where, you know, we're going to lose 10 or 15 aircraft in order to hit this target with manned people in there, but if we use drones, we're not going to lose anybody and we're going to kill 2 or 3 more civilians, you know, you get to the point where you begin to say maybe that works. But and there is no true math to it, as Professor Quigley said. I mean, they're all very difficult issues, but in terms of the equation, civilian lives count more than our own military lives at some level. And during the first Gulf War, we would fly into SAM rings, into areas where you are more likely to get shot at by SAMs in order to better protect the civilian population you're attacking. So we would take risks in order to make it less likely that we're going to kill civilians at some level. But, I mean, all these things are very hard to say what the actual numbers involved are.
I think in terms of law of warfare, you look at the population and the enemy against which you're fighting, if you're talking about military versus civilian. And you're raising the question of your own military people, if you're saving your own military people. And I think that's certainly a major reason why the drones are used. And why I think President Obama is under pressure, you know, to go that route, because if the choice is to put our own people at risk or to let the killing be done by somebody sitting in Nevada, you know, that's a no-brainer in terms of likely opposition in the United States to the overall military action. He's much better off by being able to do it without any risk to our own forces. In terms of the law of warfare, I think that's probably not relevant. But I think, you know, to some extent we are victims of our technology here. I mean, we've developed ways of killing enemies without putting ourselves at risk. So there's a great technological imperative to use that. And so if you're sitting in the Oval Office, you know, it's hard to counter that.
I would say that drones were clearly much more inaccurate than manned aircraft when we have a duty to use manned aircraft. I think that's clear. I don't think that's the case in this area, but that would be clear. Just as you're required to use smart munitions if you have them, rather than just dropping iron bombs that are unguided. even though one may cost a lot more than another, and the delivery of one might be more hazardous than the other. Yeah.
Going back to what you were discussing earlier about initiative, and the importance of initiative, as far as choosing the locale where a battle will actually occur, how important that is in military strategy. We spoke a little bit about how these terrorists can find sanctuary in other sites that aren't an active war zone. To this extent that it's almost beyond debate that we hold laws in a higher regard, that we abide by the Geneva Convention to us, let's just say that we do.
Right.
And then we kind of profess that we have a greater set of remorse as these people who come over and say, well, you bombed my village, so I'm going to put a bomb in New York City. We like to think that we hold ourselves to a higher standard. At what point are we sacrificing that legality and that morality? We just want to gain initiative. If we go into Yemen, it's not an active war zone, and say we can use the tools of the war to attack you just because, even though we're technically non-combatant, you really are a danger to us. At what point are we sacrificing, morality, legality for the initiative?
I hate to say this, morality and legality are two separate things at some level. And that's also really, it mirrors the policy legality debate. Anwar al-Awlaki is not a combatant, but being combatant is a good thing, right? Anwar al-Awlaki is a civilian directly participating in hostilities. That's the worst thing. He is directly targetable. There's no question legally that he is directly targetable. The question is he directly targetable in Yemen? And my argument is if you say no because he's in Yemen, you can't use the tools of armed conflict there. You're essentially giving sanctuary to, you're taking the rules that in every other way have been interpreted to say terrorists get nothing from the law of war other than the most base protections. You can't torture them, you can't torture them, you cannot take hostages to try to bring them out, right? You can't go and take, we know where al-Awlaki's family is, so we'll get them and threaten them in order to bring him out or something like that. You can't do those basic things found in Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. But beyond that, he is targetable. And if we read the laws to say, yes, he's targetable, but not in Yemen, not in Sudan, not in Somalia, you're basically saying you get to a sanctuary and the law will protect you and allow you to have the initiative going forward. And I really feel that that is a moral thing. I mean, if you look at who it is that al-Awlaki is trying to kill and succeeding in killing or contributing to killing, the people in Fort Hood, the people in the airline over Detroit that fortunately the guy didn't ignite, but had he done so, that's 250 civilians killed on Christmas Day. I don't have a moral problem with saying he is someone that should be targeted, whether he's in Yemen or Afghanistan. And if you want to respond, that's fine.
Well, so here's an interesting point. I was on the Christmas flight.
Really?
To Detroit. I was on that plane.
Okay.
When that happened. And I still don't think that I have a right to go to Yemen or Somalia and go after them. And here's why. I don't think that putting somebody on that plane was in any stretch of imagination of legal activity, of moral activity. It was a proper response in any kind of military capacity. But I like to think that we hold ourselves to a bit of a higher standard. I don't like the idea of giving him sanctuary, but I also don't like the idea that we can say, we will follow you anywhere, anytime, and disregard where you are. Or go into Yemen and tell people in Yemen, look, this guy's, he's here, so we're just going to go and use drones to attack him. We want to use proper authorities, we want to use police. That's fine, and obviously there's arguments because what police force does Somalia really have to speak of?
Right.
But using the tools of war outside of a war zone gives me pause.
And that's a fair point. It is, the only thing is that if you're not going to do that, then essentially what you're saying, and I think this is a policy argument you're making, rather than a legal one. You would say it is better for us, because I think part of what gives you pause is you have a sense that if we do this, we are either subverting our own belief systems, right, which is the whole reason we fight the war in the first place, is to protect our belief systems, right? So if we are losing, if we're not being true to ourselves, then we shouldn't do this. And again, that's a policy argument to say that we're not going to go to the extent that law would allow us to, because that would do something that we find to be antithetical to who we are, how we act. And I'm perfectly happy to say we can have a policy disagreement about that, but to couch it in legal terms and say it is illegal for us to do that, I think is more problematic.
The policy discussion that I think that you are having, I think, calls into question the legal basis that we're having, and is this distinction that historically has been in existence between civilians and combatants no longer applicable? And is there a movement in international law in the United States on pushing for a new Geneva Convention or protocol or that sort of like can change this or create a new rubric that allows for these strikes going forward?
The civilian combat distinction, I think, survives and should survive and actually should be bolstered. I mean, it was created because you look at the casualties in World War II, and orders of magnitude more civilians were killed than military members in that war, and the horror of that led to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. We need to separate them, we need to not target them, we need to protect them in some ways, and I think going forward that's exactly what we should be thinking of. The idea of a new Geneva Convention, I'm very much in favor of it politically. It's never going to happen. The Geneva Conventions are the only international document that the entire world is a party to. Every single nation in the world has ratified the Geneva Conventions, and that's the only international agreement that can be set up. And so to take the sort of signature document and say, we're going to try to start over, is going to be hard. There were the additional protocols that were added in 1977 that some states have signed and others have not, and that kind of thing. They do not receive as much of that universal recognition. But unfortunately, Justice Stevens, in the Hamden opinion, I think, did us a great disservice by saying this is a non-international armed conflict that fits into Common Article 3 and therefore AP 2 of the Geneva Conventions. He put it into square peg and round hole. This is an international armed conflict or transnational armed conflict between a non-state actor and a state. Geneva officially does not cover that, and that was the Bush administration's position, and I think legally they were correct in that. Now, I think there should be something that governs transnational armed conflicts, and we need to create that. But because Stevens kind of jammed this into the non-international armed conflict hole, we are now in that body of law trying to govern a transnational armed conflict. I don't think it's working very well. And I think we need to do something to amend the rules or expand the rules for transnational armed conflicts between non-state actors and states. But I think that that's been undercut somewhat because the U.S. Supreme Court makes a decision on a big international law issue, and it gets an awful lot of traction. And I know people on all sides of the debate are very upset with the fact that we don't have a law of transnational armed conflict, but they all kind of say Hamden is there, and everybody's kind of glommed on to where that put us.
Glad to hear this. I thought I was the only person who disagreed with Stevens in the Hamdan versus Rumsfeld case when it says that it's Common Article 3 that applies, because it seemed to me that what was going on in Afghanistan was clearly not a civil war. It was a war of an international character. Although I would come out the other way on it ultimately. I would agree with the district judge in that case who said that the Geneva Convention applies in its entirety. She said that there was an obligation to have the person's status as being a combatant determined by a proper tribunal, which is required under other provisions of the Geneva Convention. And Stevens, by saying it was Common Article 3 that was all that applied, kind of avoided that obligation.
The difficulty Stevens had, though, is that just by its terms, the Geneva Conventions apply between states. That's what Common Article 2 says. In an international armed conflict between two high contracting parties, non-state actors cannot be high contracting parties in Geneva Conventions. Maybe that would be another way of getting things involved, getting PLO, Hamas, FARC, people like that to sign on to the Geneva Conventions in order to get and give those kinds of rights and privileges. But if you look at the tactics that the FARC and Hamas and Al-Qaeda use, it's unlikely that they ever want to do so because their whole means of warfare are antithetical to the Geneva Convention standard.
I have a question about bilateral agreements in this context. I mean, obviously, Pakistan has had some say about the drone strikes now they're implemented. The example I was thinking of more, and this is more kind of the U.S. acting as a law enforcement, or U.S. military acting as law enforcement in South America with counter-narcotic operations, Navy ships under Coast Guard flag going into territorial waters per pre-existing agreements and apprehending drug smugglers on the ocean. Is that the solution to the Yemen problem or the Somalia problem or the Sudan problem? Is to just set up an agreement with that country that says we can carry out law enforcement operations within your territorial borders? Is that the way you get around, I guess, that the moral policy issue you have here?
Well, you have to have, Yemen has three choices. They can either be an ally, and they can be an ally and say, you may use the tools of armed conflict on our territory, you can strike him. They can be an enemy, in which case they're saying, we do not allow you to do that. We're going to harbor this enemy against you, in which case we are allowed to use the tools of armed conflict against both Yemen and al-Awlaki, just like we use the tools of armed conflict against Afghanistan when they said, the Taliban said, we're not giving you bin Laden. We're harboring him. We don't believe he did anything wrong. That gave us the right, under the UN Security Council resolution, arguably, to use the tools of armed conflict against Afghanistan. And so, enemy or ally, and then the other is neutral. And a neutral can say, we're not part of this. We don't care either way. You may not use the tools of armed conflict in our territory. And if they say that, we have to comply. They are sovereign, and if they say don't do it, we can't do it. However, they have a responsibility as a neutral to not allow their territory to be used by a party to an armed conflict. And just a really quick aside, but I think it's a good illustration. The Graf Spee incident in the beginning of World War II. Graf Spee was a German commerce raider in South American waters, tens of thousands of miles away from the Battle of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and everything else. And a British squadron of ships intercepts it, they exchange gunfire, and the Graf Spee ducks into Montevideo Harbor in Uruguay. Uruguay is neutral. And so they have to allow the Graf Spee in like they would any ship. You're allowed to come in and replenish and refuel, but you can't stay. You have to leave within 3 days, because otherwise we'd be harboring you against the British. The British can't come in here and sink you because we're neutral. But on the other hand, you can't stay because we're not allowed to harbor you. And that's what they had to do. They turned the Graf Spee out in 3 days and they scuttled themselves rather than trying to fight against a numerically superior British force. And that's how neutrality works. Yemen can say, no, you can't do this. We have to obey that. But then they have to say to al-Awlaki, you got to get out of here. Or you have to stop being a member of Al-Qaeda.
All right, looks like that. We're finished with questions. Please join me in a round of applause for our speakers then.